demanding that we shut up and go home. That night on August 11th, there was a woman who was 6 months pregnant, forced face down, while they were tear gassing us and shooting rubber and wooden bullets. That day, on August 11th, we spent the entire time, my position was, I want my constituents, especially the young ones, to exercise their First Amendment rights, but in a lawful way. I didn't want them to be on public property or on private property. I wanted them to be on public property. And my whole thing was, I need to make sure that they are following the letter of the law. But you can do what you need to do, just don't be violent about it. And that's what we were doing. It was totally peaceful, totally peaceful. And we had the uniform command. What was so hurtful is that our own state highway patrol was part of the tear gassing from day one. And the Ferguson police, they had their own tear gas. And then St. Louis County, they had their own tanks and tear gas. And none of us knew about this until we started researching it. Just weeks before, Congress had an amendment before them to ensure that there is not excessive military equipment used in one of these human disasters in the United States, and it was voted down. It was voted, including my own congressman, voted against this measure. My own congressman, who is African American, by the way, and who never showed up. He was on the eastern shore of Maryland, as we were being tear gassed, and didn't show up until Congressman Cleaver from Kansas City showed up a week later. So there's stories that I recall. There's a young man, we don't know anyone by their real name, so low-key is his name. His real name is Demetrius, but there are other people by the name of Chocolate. Chocolate was hog-tied, also pregnant in a very early part of her pregnancy. And there's a video, if you go on YouTube and do a search of police treatment in Ferguson, you'll see a woman hog-tied, upside down, unconscious. And as she's unconscious, she's being kicked. And she's pregnant. She's being kicked by the police officer. She's being kicked and unconscious while she's hog-tied. No one could ever imagine something like that would ever happen. For low-key, an amazing kid who is not only bipolar, but ADD. The week before Ferguson happened, his mother said, if you can find another guardian, I'll sign the papers. And for months, he lived on the streets. Now, I will tell you, the gift that Michael Brown has given us, there is a gift in tragedy. There is a gift. Is greater understanding, for one, of people and what goes on in their lives, and a greater sensitivity, which impacts us all. It has that ability to impact us all. But the gangs decided to put aside their rivalries. And they said, this is beyond our neighborhood rivalries. This is about a movement. There's a guy by the name of Derek. And he had just gotten out of prison after 4 years of being in prison, 14 years of being in prison. He came out and said, I'm going to be part of this movement. I don't care what happens. I've already been in jail, but this is so much greater than who I am. It's about the future. So some of these gang members that I've been referring to thought they wouldn't live more than 21 years old. And so they just expected, I'll go out, I'll do whatever I need to do, and maybe I'll get shot. They expect to be shot. That's the thing. The people that I represent, many of our young black men expect to die by the age of 21. The gift that Michael Brown gave to these young individuals is now they're thinking about their own children and making sure that they can live longer lives and not day by day or be confined to a time limit of 21 years. And so there is hope. But there's also a veil that has been lifted within our community. Now, we talk about the establishment of the YWCA of Tucson. It's interesting, in 1917, I just saw this, I was looking at some articles from the St. Louis Globe Democrats and the Republic in East St. Louis. And there was a front page article that in 1917 that said 250 Negroes killed, shot at, beaten, dead That same year, the YWCA of Tucson opened their doors to people, to help people. So while there was progress in some places in America, we were still experiencing, as the article said, a race war. And so the question is, how have we changed in 98 years? How have we changed? Have we changed at all? You know, some people may be offended, and I don't want to offend you, but it is almost a genocide that every single day an unarmed person is killed. You know, we have had now 10 shootings in my district, and I represent 206,000 people, of unarmed individuals. The young man who was shot 2 weeks ago had a mental illness, and the police just shot him. Just shot him. He didn't have a gun, he did have a knife, but everyone knew in the movement that he had a mental disability, and he was still shot. That story is multiplied 1,000 times throughout America because we're not paying attention to the problems that people had prior to Michael Brown, prior to Tamir Rice, prior to Eric Garner. The only difference is everyone has a camera now. Everyone's on alert. Everyone is on alert. You go out, and people are looking at how officers are treating people. I have friends who are officers, and let me tell you, this was one of the most difficult times that we have ever had in our relationship because on one end, they had been working for decades, literally. One of my good friends, Mike, who was shot 7 times in the last month, a police officer, a very good friend of mine, and John McLaughlin. They talked about how for 20 years in their career, they were trying to build the relationship between the black community and law enforcement, and because of one incident, all of those years of work were just wiped away. All of those years were wiped away. And I am not going according to my speech right now. That's just what's happening. So, this is pretty bad. I knew that I wasn't going to do this anyway. So, I often think back to the reaction and the sense of shock. I mean, if you looked at the people's faces, there were grown men crying. I don't know if any of you have had this experience, but I didn't prior to August 9th. I've never held a grown man cry. Ever. And that feeling of helplessness and despair, you feel it in your soul and you never forget it. This man had been protesting. He's disabled, has a cane, and he had his chair. He was with his mother, and he had his sign, you know, just protect our bodies or protect our young souls, whatever it was. And then we had something called the 5-second rule that was ruled unconstitutional in St. Louis County courts. They said you can't establish a law that says you have a 5-second rule. You have to keep moving. You can't stand more than 5 seconds. So this man who has this cane, who had been in his lawn chair for days, cried in my arms. And he says, I can't walk. These people are preventing me from exercising my rights. And I knew that there was something wrong. For Heather, my friend, who is white, by the way, she's the one who was in a wheelchair dragged by police. She's one of our white allies. She's one of our white allies who streams every single day and every single protest to look at some of these things that are happening so the entire country knows. But everyone had to make an assessment of what was going on. So many people were in shock. So many people are still trying to process what the heck just went on. Again, I had white constituents who were like, I didn't know. After the DOJ report comes out, there are a lot of people who didn't know I'm living in this community that would allow dogs to bite people in a stop. Really? The ticketing while walking? That's really what happened to Michael Brown, is he was stopped while walking in the middle of the street, no probable cause whatsoever. You know, there was no, at the time, the police officer didn't know about his encounter at the convenience store because it wasn't called on the radio at all. He was just walking with his friends. And, you know, I would say there are people who do bad things, but we have something called due process. And you can't pick and choose who is governed under the law. You can't pick and choose. It's not just for one segment of the population and not for the other. The law is the law. The danger faced by Black youth was further elaborated with the DOJ report. When their investigation into Ferguson revealed the history of racial abuse and corruption, showing us that the pieces were all in place for mutual distrust, the natural suspicion against Black youth, the eagerness with which force is applied when they won't cooperate with that treatment. These understated offenses that over time have brought whole communities to their knees. In environments like these, what are people to think? When we look at what happened in Baltimore, when a Black man in good enough condition to evade pursuit was apprehended, thrown into a police van, and came back out with a severed spine. I do not condone violence in any form of expression, and I never will, but when these communities show their anger, their hurts, are people honestly confused? Yes, we are. People who are truly familiar with institutional racism are aware of the deeper heartbreak. It is a wound that affects how we regard our fate, undermining our pride in ourselves and the country that treats us this way, touching every level of our identities. The insult to accompany this injury, many people refuse to admit that racism even still exists. So many people walking around today still live in that blissful little corner where we're all on an even playing field, and the only thing affecting our future is our choices. Never mind that the same behaviors between white and Black people get entirely different treatment from law enforcement, and the same qualifications between men and women result in different jobs and different pay. What happened to Michael Brown made that corner harder to live in. It shined a light on everything that had led to that terrible moment: unequal education, substandard housing, no access to good jobs, and a police and court system that, as was later proven by the DOJ report, had been targeting minorities for years. From the racially motivated stops to the endless cycle of increasing court fines, the damage had continued for generations. Consider this. When a single woman gets a massive court fine for some municipal offense and isn't able to make her court date, of which she wasn't informed, and because she didn't have a car, how does her situation look now, with a brand new fee piled on? After the loss of her job, her savings, how does she provide for her son, for whom crime is now looking like a more attractive option every single day? Now take the scenario and multiply it by neighborhoods and entire cities. What you have is an equation that removes hope, removes opportunity, until there is little room to live and thrive within lawful society. And like the efficient machine it is, this system has already got a prison cell waiting for the moment anyone slips up. Now, I believe that you all are familiar with some of these points, as I've seen the Tucson YWCA has contributed to some of the dialogue surrounding the mass incarceration of African Americans and others. I must say that I appreciated your organization drawing attention to how women are being affected by this with your recent forums. I saw one alarming figure that showing that the fastest growing inmate population right now is female, with 60% of them being drug charges. While that number is, by itself, disheartening, the fact that we know about these developments allows us to do something about it, and there are many places to start. We see the symptoms, but how do we go about repairing the damage to identity, self-worth, and trust that has been done to our communities by this corrupt system? From the ground, there are a number of approaches, but it all starts with the organization. Like with the events you all put on, in order to change the system, we need people to engage with it and no longer feel like outsiders. Your organization's focus on women's entrepreneurship is a great example of a exactly what our goal should be, to rebalance that opportunity equation I spoke of earlier. And first, in my approach was to teach civic engagement before they burned down that building. But that's what I did, and I decided to help people reclaim their voices and began teaching classes on the subject. While it's hard to blame folks for not having much faith in an arrangement that regularly cheats and imprisons them, I wanted to give them the tools to speak out against that injustice they have been experiencing for such a long time. In this case, it was not without a challenge. A lot of my constituents didn't know their councilman or their mayor. They were isolated from the process entirely. I encouraged them to have discussions with elected officials. The lack of education was also an issue here. Michael Brown attended, luckily graduated, but he attended one of the 2 unaccredited school districts in the state of Missouri. And he was intending to go on to higher education the Monday after he was killed. I had to teach people how to properly express themselves. While their frustrations were valid, they had to learn to not just show their anger. And believe me, there was a lot of anger. You could see it in their faces, everyone. Mothers who saw their girls and their boys all being in the same situation as Michael Brown. There is one of our allies, Wu. He is very Irish with red hair, but he was also, because he was one of our, again, white allies, was targeted by police officers and beaten severely because he was one of our white allies. And he endured a lot for us. He didn't have to do that, but he did. He didn't have to. And so the police came back to him and reminded him that, hey, look, you're on your paper still. If you come out here one more time, we're going to make sure you go back to jail. This is Wu. Again, everybody doesn't have a real name. They have their nicknames on the streets, but you got to live with that. So this constituent of mine who I said, I want you to meet with your council person. I want you to talk about the different ordinances that they were thinking about passing because of what happened in Ferguson. I want you to sit down with her and tell her about your vision. Well, here's what happened. Kim is the councilwoman's name. She's white. My constituent queen, Doherty, is black. There is a building, an old Ponderosa building, that had been vacant for a very long time. Together, they worked to make sure that building was donated for a children's youth center. And right now, one of our institutions that works on, I don't know how to say this, but engineering, electrical engineering, they donated over $30,000 to do all of the electrical work in that building that was donated to Queen Doherty. And that is because of the classes that I taught. And I'm glad that people are learning how to empower themselves instead of waiting for so long. People have been waiting to be told what to do. You know, if you're Puerto Rican, you don't wait for somebody to tell you what to do. You just do it. And then you apologize later. You just do it. You don't ask. That's one of our problems, you know, as minorities, as women, we wait for someone to say it's okay. You know, why do we have to wait for someone to tell us something is okay to do? If we think something is right, this is what I tell young people, like your son over there that I'm looking at. If ever you're doing something with good intentions, don't ever let someone close the door on your face. You put your foot in that door and you demand respect. There are many legislative approaches to also consider at this time. As you can imagine, our post-Ferguson session has been a really busy one for me. I filed multiple bills. I have 4 or 5 bills dealing with Ferguson. This week, I'm so excited, we passed our updated deadly force bill. And we included initially probable cause. That was very controversial because in our state statutes, probable cause is not defined because there are a list of court cases that define probable cause in multiple ways. So we had to get through that. But the language that I was able to get in was objective reasonableness, which is outside of Tennessee versus Garner. I want to say Graham versus Collins, the 1989 case, is what allowed us to have that language, that terminology, objective reasonableness. And it's Justice Rehnquist, believe it or not, who wanted to have that terminology because he felt as though reasonable belief was too vague. And the great thing about this terminology, you can tell I get geeked out over the law and these opinions and all that, but the great thing about it is it has an implication on juries and their instructions. And if you know anything about the feeling that my community has with our prosecuting attorney, we have never trusted him. He did not even provide the accurate instructions for the jury. Now, when you have a grand jury, and I'm not an attorney, but when you have a grand jury, you have a very low threshold. If there is an outstanding question that you cannot answer, that case deserves an indictment. Well, this grand jury in St. Louis, what they decided to do is treat this case as if they were the trial jury and not the grand jury, which was a huge disservice to the community and also allowed for the continuing distrust that has happened. Now, here's what I've done. We had a huge issue in our elections. Again, I'm a Democrat, but the Democrats were divided. They were divided. Many of my colleagues never showed up, ever. And it was a huge political issue, and it continues to be a huge issue. And we're having to focus on that and find our allies slowly but surely, but we're doing it. But I have to tell you that one of the consequences, and this is what you can do as women, is when you are elected, and there are things that you can do to affect change and bring in trust, go ahead and do it. So for the first time in the history of Missouri, St. Louis County, our board of election commissioners are all black for the first time. I made a deal, Kelly, with our governor. I had a remonstrance, and if any of you know of a remonstrance, you rarely ever file those when you're in the Senate. Rarely. Like in the last decade, there have only been 3 remonstrances, and I have 2 of the 3. And for the first one, she was fired. And for the other one, I made a deal with the governor. We are going to have to bring trust back into the system. And I told him, because of what our county executive did in just ignoring the community and the needs of the community, I want to work with you so that we can bring back trust. And he said, okay, if you withdraw your remonstrance, if you withdraw it, I will get 2 African Americans on the St. Louis County Board of Elections. St. Louis County is not even a majority African American, but now, at least our county Board of Elections is. Passing legislation that is friendly to minorities and women can be a tall order back in Missouri, with the political landscape being what it is. But I know you are all familiar with that struggle. I heard they passed this bill here recently. It is similar to legislation I've seen in my own home state, making sure that women could not obtain an abortion or coverage for an abortion through the federal marketplace. I actually heard a quote, I think it was the House Majority Leader, saying he wanted to ensure public funds could never be used to subsidize the process. Like I said, we hear similar statements back at home. That struck me as a great concept, not having to pay for things you disapprove of, even indirectly. So from now on, none of my tax dollars are going to go to things that I consider terrible. Abstinence-only sex ed courses, no. The court and prison costs of racially motivated arrests, can't spare any change for that one. Military hardware purchases for police agencies so they can deploy tear gas against unarmed civilians, hell no. But I digress. These are frustrations I understand, and these political climates being born a woman means that your health interests land on the wrong side of the moral compass. But today we're talking about a different kind of compass, aren't we? Our discussion of right and wrong goes past condemning individuals on their behavior in just any one snapshot. Instead, we look at the broad strokes, the patterns that over time roll into cycles of injustice. In the case of women, these rhythms become tradition and then morality. The result is a world where male legislators feel at home policing women's use of their own bodies. For minorities, life becomes a rigged game with no one way out. No way to win if you play by the rules. But that's why it's so important that we're here, all of us, right now, talking about these institutional problems. History does not need to repeat itself. It's true. Breaking the cycle of poverty and crime and incarceration might seem like a tall order when you say it out loud. But when I visit groups like the YWCA of Tucson, I actually see all of you in front of me, gathered for that cause, the cause for women and minorities. Changing the game is definitely not impossible, not from where I'm standing and looking at you. I also want to end with this. I believe that education is the key to success. It is the foundation of life. It is the tool that provides every single person the opportunity to compete and to succeed. And anytime we take away that opportunity for young people to succeed in their way, whatever that may be, then we are harming the success of our nation. It is a national security issue by under-educating our young people. So for any of you who have not given yet, I want to tell you, it's really important. That's why we're here. So I wrote out a check. And there are only a couple of times I wrote out a check from my campaign outside of the state of Missouri. But we can do that under our laws. And I believe that what you are doing. And there are so many other things that I'm not even talking about. You guys live so close to the border. And you have to deal with multiple issues. That law that was passed, that inhumane law dealing with immigration some years ago, they tried to introduce that in Missouri. They took it from your example. They took your legislation and said, we're going to file it here. I said, no. But I remember, I'll go back when I was in the House. There was a bill dealing with immigration, and it was terrible. We went back to the 1845 slave statutes of Missouri. There are 4 components to the 1870 or 1845 slave statutes. 1, you cannot house a slave, you cannot employ a slave, you cannot create false documentation for a slave, and something else I didn't remember. That was the legislation for immigrants. It was the 1845 slave statutes. And it was, I want to say it was House Bill 1493. I could be wrong, it was 1490, 1493. And I cried. There was some small city in Texas that was so injurious, those council people were speaking in Spanish when they had a council meeting. So we had to make, for Missouri, English the official language. Well, the Federalist Papers were written in 7 different languages. The Federalist Papers. And to injure a community, a state, a nation, by limiting the languages that we speak is inhumane. It is. I talked to a council, and you tell me to shut up, Kelly, because I filibustered. I filibuster, so you tell me when to shut up.
Here's one thing I learned from you, Maria. You never tell a woman to sit down and shut up.
Thank you all for being here.